Hi, I'm Melina. I'm at the 2017 Canadian Science Policy Conference. I have here with me Dr. Kelly Bronson. She's a Canadian Research Chair candidate for Science and Society. We're really happy to have you here. Kelly, can you tell us more about your work at the University of Ottawa and what makes it important and unique?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. So as you said, I am at the University of Ottawa. I'm a sociologist currently, and I'm affiliated with something called the Institute for Science, Society and Policy, the ISSP, which really sits on a three-legged stool between scientists, governance actors, and other policymakers and communities. And it researches issues relevant to science policy. My research focuses on decision-making around controversial technologies, so genetically modified organisms, the siting of large hydroelectric dam projects, and currently I have a project looking at machine intelligence or big data in the agricultural sector in Canada. The work I do really focuses on what policymakers typically call social license, or broadly social acceptance for decision-making on technologies. And what I do is I try to investigate, looking backward, cases and understand cases where social license has not been achieved around technical decisions, but also, and predominantly, I research and I forward, or I'm developing methods for achieving social license around controversial decisions. So for example, and I would say actually that some of my research has shown that one way to achieve social license in technical policymaking is to include members of the public or a wide variety of societal needs and concerns early on in decision-making on technologies, whether it's at the innovation phase or in the structuring of governance, regulatory regimes, say, around technologies. And I have a current project actually looking at artificial intelligence or machine intelligence and big data in the agricultural sector. And this is really sort of an innovation that's just afoot right now in agriculture. And what I'm doing is I'm using qualitative research with designers, engineers in both government and industry, as well as with a wide variety of farmers to try to incorporate these different perspectives into decision making, whether it's design or also regulation of these tools. You asked me why the work is important.
Yes.
It's important because projects like the big data project I have in agriculture, hopefully, and I think research proves, they engender trust and also equity and justice in the innovation process. A word or phrase that's being used commonly right now in policymaking is inclusive innovation.
Yes.
So the work that I do helps to further inclusive innovation processes. But also, I think that history has shown, or experience has shown, that innovations that don't gain social license fail to do so at an enormous cost, both socially and often economically. So my work helps to seek some redress for that, or to prevent that. And what makes it unique? Well, what makes my research somewhat unique is actually my background. I have a now somewhat distant background as a lab bench scientist, but I think that allows me to see this science-society relationship from both sides of the fence. And that gives me a kind of sensitivity when I'm helping to integrate different kinds of knowledge in these decision-making processes. So for example, I was part of an environmental review on a large dam project in New Brunswick, and there I worked with engineers, hydrologists, and myself as a social scientist to try to encourage these very technical experts to think about the social and cultural impacts or potential impacts of this dam project in their impact assessment.
I think your job is amazing because you work at this intersection where you draw in the public and scientists and policymakers. And so that leads into the next question, which is more targeted towards ordinary citizens. And what is at risk if citizens do not get involved in these policy-making processes? And for those who are interested, what can they use as leverage to join the decision-making process?
What can citizens
Yes.
do? The first part of the question, I think, again, experience shows and academic case studies show that decisions that are technical on technologies, whether it's regulatory decisions or even decisions about which technologies to fund, say government decisions about R&D, if they fail to account for public experiences, knowledge, we might say, concerns, they often fail to gain social license, and they do so again at an enormous cost. So that failure to include or to think about innovation in an inclusive way can be really costly, so it can lead to bad policy outcomes, effectively, is what I'm saying, both in the sense of undemocratic outcomes.
Yes.
So, technologies that just reproduce current power relationships, and sequester power and money in the hands of a few, as opposed to being of benefit to a wide variety of players in Canadian society or other society. But also technologies that fail to account for societal needs and concerns can fail due to public protest, for example, at an enormous economic cost.
Yes.
So I'm thinking of the example of Roundup Ready wheat.
Yeah.
So in 2004, a co-developed between the Canadian federal government and Monsanto Corporation GMO, Roundup Ready wheat, was set for commercialization. And so it was invested in heavily in the design phase, and it was almost through the regulatory process, but it failed due to public protest. And it was an interesting case because the protest was from a wide array of players, environmental activists, but also a wide array of farmers from across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
So that failure, I think we can see that failure as a failure to account for the needs and concerns of end users in the design process, and also the management process, because part of the protest was around the regulatory structure for GMOs. So right after that product, that technology or innovation was shelved due to public protest, a series of members' bills were introduced across Canada and provinces across Canada that really called for a revision of the Seed Regulations Act, saying that the act didn't take account of societal concerns.
Yeah.
And I think we see the lingering effects in terms of the science-society relationship or the trust between citizens and governance actors or around GMOs, around the science, around the technologies. We see the lingering effects today. So the Ontario Science Centre just did a survey, I don't know if you're aware of science literacy, and 52% of Canadians said they don't trust the scientific consensus on GMOs. And I think that's in part a product of this failure to include, engage publics early on in the process of innovation around GMOs.
So how can the public be engaged prior to having to go out and protest?
What resources? Well, members of the public, I think the onus is on, and I think scientists currently are quite good in Canada about doing this, mobilizing their knowledge. But I think that, and they demand of citizens, right? The citizens have a degree of scientific literacy in order to be able to engage. So I think that's one thing that citizens could do, right? Is help themselves be aware or make themselves aware, not just of the scientific facts, so that there's a consensus around the safety, health, and environmental safety of GMOs, but also about the scientific process. This is something that I call critical science literacy, and it's not my concept. It's the concept coming from the editor of an academic journal called Science Communication. But critical science literacy is really not just making oneself aware of textbook facts and scientific knowledge, like consensus on innovations or technologies, but also it's about understanding how science is conducted. So, it's about understanding that methodological diversity is a part of science, right? So just because there might be conflicting experts weighing in on a particular controversy or a particular technology, that shouldn't undermine expertise, right? Those people might have different research questions, right? Different perspectives, and that doesn't necessarily undermine the expertise. It's also about understanding that science never delivers certainties, right? Science advances in terms of by induction and delivers probabilistic knowledge. And so we can't expect scientists, and members of the public shouldn't expect scientists to say anything with certainty. Those are in the end, policy decisions that members of the public should get involved in. I think the onus is on members of the public, really. I think that members of the public should demand of, especially public science, inclusion, right? To some extent, especially affected communities. But I think that the onus is also on members of the public to help themselves understand not only scientific consensus on any particular matter, but also, to a basic extent, how scientific knowledge gets made. And I think that would be a good resource for engendering the kind of inclusive innovation or technical policymaking that we're talking about.
That's really neat idea. I haven't really heard of that, getting citizens to learn about the process of knowledge gathering as well.
Yeah.
Because normally people are talking about facts.
Right.
But that really leads me into the next question then. So how do scientists and policymakers convey this process of knowledge getting and also their own interests? How do you communicate that to the public?
That's a really good question. Well, so for example, there are, and I think on the panel that I will be speaking on, there is a science journalist, the Globe journalist Ivan Semeniak, and I use his science journalism in my teaching because it's often very good in telling a story not just about the findings of any scientific project or in conveying a scientific consensus on a matter like global warming or GMO health and safety, but also telling about the research design, right? So a science journalist, or that, in terms of the science communication sphere, if we're thinking about that actor, the science journalist, they could ask questions of an expert, not just about their opinion or their expert opinion on any matter, but also about the process they followed broadly in their research, the research questions they asked from the get-go, even questions that speak to the broader context of the research. So who's funding the research, for example?
Yep.
That's a really important thing that publics need to help need in order to help them be able to evaluate different kinds of knowledge, especially in today's era of post-truth and right, the understanding who is speaking and who did the research, and those are really important facts or pieces of the puzzle for a member of the public to have in order to be able to weigh different kinds of knowledge. I think that there's real hope in the government right now, the Canadian federal government. If I think about Minister Duncan's, it seems that there are structures in place right now, more structures for inclusion or inclusive innovation or inclusive decision making around the sciences and around technologies. She seems really concerned to incorporate a diversity of perspectives or knowledge. Think of traditional ecological knowledge or in scientific processes. And if you think of the Barton report on inclusive innovation, I think there are real moments of hope right now for restructuring happening at the federal level in Canada for bringing members of the public in. I think that people like myself have a really important role to play.
Yes.
We can't really expect a scientist or even a regulator, we expect them to be necessarily expert trained, and their technical training leads to a kind of necessary myopia. I know as an ex-biologist that, in my work, I was asking one small question on one particular plant. The whole lab I worked in worked on one plant, Thomas umbellatus or flowering rush, answering environmental questions broadly, but from a very narrow perspective. And that's necessary to be productive in the sciences and to do good work. And, even regulators are necessarily narrowly trained. And so I don't think it's fair for us to expect them to be able to consider the broad societal impacts or considerations in their work. But then the onus is on people like myself to forward processes for inclusive decision making, to encourage, again, as a sociologist say on an environmental review, encourage these narrowly trained experts to think more broadly about the public face of science.
Yeah. So how do you think research institutes and policy-making organizations can restructure to include more people at the intersection?
That's a really good question. I think, and maybe this is just because of, it's the work that I do, but I think one of the really pressing questions vis-a-vis science policy today, not just in Canada, but globally, is how. What are the processes by which we further inclusive innovation or inclusivity in the sciences? There's, I think now, broad acceptance of the importance of responsible innovation and inclusive innovation, but the how, what processes can we use to include members of the public or lay experts in these highly technical decisions? And how do we integrate different kinds of knowledge with the technical expertise in the formulation of an evidence-based decision?
Yeah.
Those are really key questions that I don't think we have the answer on. And to be honest, I think the research shows that it's often case specific. So even deciding who constitutes the public or the interested community often depends on the particular technology you're discussing, or if you're discussing a dam project, part of the decision making is case specific, right? You have to think about, okay, who are the communities most affected by this decision? Who do we bring on board? So developing, context-driven or universal recommendations for restructuring, I'm not sure that's even a possibility. What we can do, I think, as researchers like myself, is develop guidance, right?
Yes.
A set of best practices, looking backward at what has worked, and also we can help highly trained experts think broadly in their decision-making process.
I'm really glad that there are many leaders like yourself in Canada helping experts to reach the public and policymakers. Yep.
Well, thanks.
Can I ask you what you think is great about the CSPC?
Sure. The CSPC is great. I think it's great primarily because it's a huge tent. So it brings together a wide variety of actors across disciplines, from in academia, across the science society, natural scientists and social scientists like myself. It brings together people working across government departments, all interested in the pressing questions, science policy questions today. And of course, there are many today. How do we regulate artificial intelligence or machine intelligence? Again, I have this project asking that question, specifically looking at machine intelligence in the agricultural sector in Canada. How do we regulate artificial intelligence? How do we account for different kinds of knowledge, say First Nations or Aboriginal knowledge in resource governance decisions? There are lots of pressing questions, and I think it's a CSPC is a big tent. So it brings together people who are broadly interested in those questions, and I think also because it's action-oriented, this conference, it brings together people who might not ordinarily get together, and it does so effectively because in the end, I believe all of us here are interested to use our expertise to do something.
Yes.
And so I think that's why it works.
Thank you. Before we go, can you tell me where to find out more about your work online?
People can find more of my work on, if they're academics, on, or I guess even if not, on academia.edu if they participate in that platform. I have a university website with the University of Ottawa, and I'm generally in the media, so they can look for me in the CBC. And
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Kelly, for joining us
Thank
and
you
for
for
being at
inviting
the CSPC 2017.
thank you.